this is the problem, because I can understand why both Conservative and Labour leaders don't want to stoke up the European issue, because it will immediately project immigration into the forefront of the election campaign, because that will then allow the Nigel Farage bunch, whoever, whatever label they've got at the time, to accuse them of opening the floodgates to more immigrants. And frankly, I've lived long enough to know where that argument goes. I mean, we saw Mosley in the black shirts in the 1930s. We saw Enoch Powell mobilizing the Smithfield Porters in the 1960s. And then we saw the growth of UKIP and Reform and those extremist organizations in the context of more modern times. So there's nothing new in this.
It's the word that dominated the election campaign 5 years ago, but now everybody is keeping stum about it. But should we be hearing more from our political leaders about Britain's relationship with Europe in this election campaign? It's not really featuring in anything Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer are saying. Not even the Liberal Democrats, who of course pledged to stop Brexit altogether in 2019, are really talking about the EU or even the single market. Well, one man who is frustrated by this state of affairs is the former Deputy Prime Minister, Michael Heseltine, Lord Heseltine, who joins me on the line now. Lord Heseltine, good morning.
Morning to you.
You've called this the most dishonest general election of your life, and you've seen quite a few of them. Why is that?
Basically, because of the reasons that you've just given, that the overarching issue of our time is our relationship with Europe. And neither of the big parties will talk about it. And the reason they won't talk about it is because they're frightened of the extreme right-wing threat to the red wall seats that moved from Labour to Conservative in the Brexit debate. And they're frightened that if they are seen to be in any way interested in restoring our relationship with Europe, the spectre of immigration will become central to this election campaign. And so they won't talk about it. But the fact of the matter is that on all the issues of substance that affect this country, any coherent policy demands cooperation with Europe. We are a European power. We've always been a European power. And to try and somehow pretend that there's a world out there in which Britain matters and is influential, independent of our relationship with Europe, is frankly just deception.
And when you say issues are being debated from the election with the big omission of Europe in the policy prescriptions our politicians are offering, what are those sorts of issues? Are you talking about, say, the economy, migration? You know, both leaders pretending they have the answers, but not addressing our relationship with Europe.
Well, take your sister newspaper this morning, which carries a substantial report from the president of the British Chambers of Commerce, making it quite clear that, in her view, we have to restore our relationship with Europe, because that reflects the view of the companies that she represents. So it's not me that's starting this hair. It is widely argued. I read a very interesting article by Danny Finkelstein in the Times and one by Philip Stevens in the Financial Times, making very much the same similar points.
Indeed. And which party do you think would stand to benefit, Lord Heseltine, from making Europe an election issue? Does the Labour Party, you can understand why the Labour Party is anxious to be seen to be more, receptive to closer relations with Europe, given what happened to them in 2019?
Yes, this is the problem, because I can understand why both Conservative and Labour leaders don't want to stoke up the European issue, because it will immediately project immigration into the forefront of the election campaign, because that will then allow the Nigel Farage bunch, whoever, whatever label they've got at the time, to accuse them of opening the floodgates to more immigrants. And frankly, I've lived long enough to know where that argument goes. I mean, we saw Mosley in the black shirts in the 1930s. We saw Enoch Powell mobilizing the Smithfield Porters in the 1960s. And then we saw the growth of UKIP and Reform and those extremist organizations in the context of more modern times. So there's nothing new in this. And if you look across the world, there are people tearing each other apart on tribalism and racism. It's as old as history, the suspicion that someone who's slightly different is a threat and has to be resisted and indeed persecuted. So I can understand the politics of it, but I'm afraid I have to say that it is dishonest and it is, frankly, just parading platitudes in substitute for policies.
Well, obviously you're a peer, Lord Heseltine, so you can't vote in general elections. But would you vote, given what you've just said about some of the rhetoric coming out of your the party you represented for so long? Would you vote for the Conservative Party with any enthusiasm?
I could never vote for a Brexit party. I mean, how could I? I worked for my party when Churchill was proclaiming we need to create a kind of United States of Europe. I worked for Helmut Millen when he applied to join. I worked for Ted Heath when he succeeded. I worked for Margaret Thatcher when she created the single European market, probably the biggest achievement of her life. And he was seriously telling me that I should now, somehow or other, because Nigel Farage has become a figure of influence, that I should say, oh, they were all wrong. I'm awfully sorry. I made a terrible mistake. I frankly am all too clear the Tory party has left people like me, and I am not going to be persuaded by the most pernicious forms of argument that democracy can thrust in front of people.
Well, Keir Starmer may convince you, or he may not, Lord Heseltine. He's been asked about Europe on the campaign trail already, and he did say just about that Labour would opt for a closer relationship with the European Union. Let's take a listen.
We've got to take that on, closer relationship. I think actually not just in trade, but also in defence. I think there's huge scope for closer work on defence and security. And also education, by the way, I think we could do a lot closer work on.
There's not much detail there, though, Lord Heseltine.
Quite right. There were just platitudes.
Just platitudes. I think lots of people would say that about much of Labour's manifesto, but there we are. Lord Heseltine, the former Deputy Prime Minister, thank you very much for joining us to set out why you think this general election is the most dishonest in British history. Nobody is talking about Europe.